London, September 1979. The filming of Dressed to Kill had brought Michael Caine to a grimy area near London Bridge every morning for 3 weeks. Each day, as his driver took the same route to the set, Michael noticed the same figure sitting beneath the railway arches, an elderly man in a tattered overcoat, always reading, always alone. Most people hurried past without a glance, treating him like part of the urban landscape. But something about the man intrigued Michael. Maybe it was the way he held his book, or the careful way he turned each page, or simply the fact that while everyone else ignored him, he seemed completely absorbed in whatever he was reading. Michael had no idea that this chance observation would lead to a discovery that would not only change both their lives, but reveal a secret that would shock the British literary establishment and prove that genius can survive in the most unlikely places. The morning routine had become familiar to Michael. His car would turn off Borough High Street at exactly 7:45 a.m., pass under the Victorian Railway Bridge, and continue toward the converted warehouse that served as their film studio. Every single day the old man was there, positioned on a piece of cardboard against the brick wall, a small collection of belongings nearby, and always without exception reading. Most homeless people Michael had encountered over the years sat with empty expressions, asking for spare change, or talking to themselves. This man was different. He never looked up from his book when people passed. He never called out for money. He simply read with the focused intensity of a scholar in a university library. "Governor, you've been watching that old fellow every day for 3 weeks," his driver Tommy Sullivan observed on a Thursday morning. "You thinking of doing something?" Michael realized he had been staring. "I'm curious about what he's reading. In all my years in London, I've never seen a homeless person so absorbed in literature." Tommy chuckled. Probably some old newspaper he found in a bin. But Michael wasn't convinced. The man's posture, the way he held the book, the careful attention he paid to each page, it didn't look like someone reading discarded newspaper. It looked like serious study. That afternoon, after filming wrapped, Michael made an impulsive decision. Instead of heading straight home, he asked Tommy to drop him off near the bridge. "You sure about this, Mr. Caine? That area can be a bit rough after dark." "I'll be fine, Tommy. Pick me up in an hour." Michael approached the railway arches cautiously, not wanting to startle or threaten the old man. As he got closer, he could see more clearly what the man was reading, and his surprise was immediate and genuine. It was a worn copy of Shakespeare's King Lear, and the man was making notes in the margins with a pencil stub. "Excuse me," Michael said gently, stopping a respectful distance away. The man looked up and Michael was struck by his eyes, clear, intelligent, alert. Despite his unkempt appearance in obviously difficult circumstances, there was dignity in his bearing. "Yes?" the man said, his accent clearly educated, perhaps upper class. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I couldn't help noticing you're reading Shakespeare. I'm an actor and I've done some Shakespeare myself. It's not often you see someone studying it so intently." The man smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his weathered features. "Ah, an actor. Then you'll appreciate this particular passage." He gestured to the open page. Act 4, Scene 6. Gloucester's speech about the gods killing us for their sport. Devastating poetry. But the real genius is in how Shakespeare sets up Edgar's response just 12 lines later. Michael was stunned. This wasn't casual reading pieces, this was sophisticated literary analysis from someone who clearly understood the text at a deep level. "Would you mind if I sat down?" Michael asked. "I'd love to hear your thoughts on that scene." The man gestured to a relatively clean patch of pavement. "Please, I don't often get the chance to discuss literature with someone who might appreciate it." Michael settled himself on the ground, ignoring the strangeness of the situation. "I'm Michael, by the way. Pleased to meet you, Michael. I'm Edward." For the next 30 minutes they discussed King Lear with a depth and sophistication that matched any university seminar Michael had ever attended. Edward's insights were brilliant. He understood not just the language and themes, but the historical context, the literary influences, the way Shakespeare's other works informed this particular play. "Edward," Michael said finally, "I have to ask, how do you know so much about literature?" Edward's expression became guarded. "I've had time to read, but this isn't casual reading. You're analyzing the text like a scholar." Edward was quiet for a long moment. apparently deciding whether to trust Michael with something important. "I suppose there's no harm in telling you," he said finally. "I was a literature professor at Oxford for 23 years. Medieval and Renaissance drama was my specialty." Michael felt as if the ground had shifted beneath him. "You were an Oxford professor?" "Until 1975. Department of English Literature. I had tenure. A comfortable life. A wife, 2 children." Edward's voice became distant. Then everything changed. He told Michael the story in careful, measured sentences, as if he'd rehearsed it many times but rarely had the opportunity to share it. His wife Helen and their 2 children, James and Sarah, had been killed in a car accident while driving to visit Edward's mother for Christmas. A drunk driver had run a red light and hit their car head-on. Helen died instantly. The children survived for 3 days in the hospital before succumbing to their injuries. "I held my daughter's hand when she died," Edward said quietly. "She was 8 years old. She asked me to read her The Tempest because she knew it was my favorite." Michael felt tears in his eyes. "Edward, I'm so sorry. After the funeral, I tried to continue teaching. The university was very understanding, gave me time off, offered counseling, but I couldn't stand in front of a classroom talking about literature when literature had been the last thing my daughter heard before she died." Edward had gradually withdrawn from his position. He'd stopped attending faculty meetings, stopped preparing lectures, stopped engaging with colleagues. Eventually, the university had little choice but to accept his resignation. "I sold the house, gave away most of my possessions, and found I couldn't bear to be around people who knew what had happened. Everyone looked at me with pity. Every conversation became about my tragedy." So he'd started walking. From Oxford through the countryside, eventually to London. He'd been living rough for over 4 years, moving from place to place, surviving on odd jobs and occasional charity. "But why do you continue reading?" Michael asked. "If literature is connected to such painful memories." Edward smiled sadly. "Because it's all I have left of them. When I read The Tempest, I hear Sarah's voice asking questions. When I study Hamlet, I remember James arguing with me about whether the prince is truly mad or just pretending. Literature was how we connected as a family. It's the only way I can still feel close to them." Michael was deeply moved by Edward's story, but also puzzled by something. "Edward, if you don't mind me asking, what do you do with all this knowledge? I mean, you're clearly brilliant. You understand these texts better than most professors, but you're living under a bridge." Edward looked embarrassed. "Actually, I write. I've been working on various projects, literary analysis, some creative work. I have a typewriter in my room at the hostel." "You have a room?" "3 nights a week when I can afford it. The YMCA has a program for people like me. I do some cleaning work in exchange for a bed and access to their facilities." "What kind of writing?" Edward hesitated. "Well, I've been working on some screenplays, actually, adaptations of classic literature for film. I know it's probably foolish, but I thought perhaps." Michael's interest was immediately piqued. "You've written screenplays?" "Several. I've adapted Othello, Macbeth, Dr. Faustus, even some Chaucer. I try to stay true to the original texts while making them accessible for modern audiences." Michael's mind was racing. Here was a man with deep literary knowledge, obvious talent, and the passion to create new work, living in poverty because he'd withdrawn from the world after an unimaginable tragedy. "Edward, would you be willing to show me some of your writing?" "You're just being kind." "No, I'm being serious. I'm always looking for good material, and if you've written adaptations of classic literature, I'd genuinely like to read them." Edward studied Michael's face carefully. "You really mean it?" "I really mean it. Are you free tomorrow? I could meet you here, and we could go somewhere more comfortable to discuss your work." Yes. I think I'd like that very much." They arranged to meet the next afternoon. As Michael waited for Tommy to pick him up, he couldn't stop thinking about Edward's story and the waste of talent it represented. That evening at dinner, Michael told his wife Shakira about the encounter. "A homeless Oxford professor," she said. "That's extraordinary. What's even more extraordinary is his intelligence and dignity. Shakira, this man has been living rough for 4 years, but he still carries himself like the scholar he is. What are you thinking of doing?" Michael considered the question. "I'm not sure yet. but I can't just walk away knowing that someone with his abilities is sleeping under bridges. The next day, Michael arrived at the railway arches to find Edward waiting with a battered briefcase. He was cleaner than he'd been the day before. Clearly, he'd made an effort to prepare for their meeting. "Shall we find a cafe where we can talk properly?" Michael suggested. They walked to a small restaurant near Borough Market. The owner looked skeptical about Edward's appearance, but Michael's presence ensured they were seated and served without incident. Edward opened his briefcase and withdrew several typed manuscripts. The pages were worn from handling, but the typing was meticulous and professional. "This is my adaptation of Othello," Edward said, handing Michael the first script. "I've tried to preserve Shakespeare's language while creating a structure that would work for modern cinema." Michael began reading, and within the first few pages he knew he was looking at something special. Edward had maintained the poetic power of Shakespeare's dialogue while creating visual sequences that would translate beautifully to film. The character development was subtle and sophisticated, the pacing was perfect, and the adaptation showed deep understanding of both literature and cinema. "Edward, this is brilliant," Michael said after reading for 20 minutes. "This isn't just a good adaptation, this is exceptional work." Edward's face flushed with pleasure. "Really? You're not just being polite." "I'm never polite about bad writing," Michael said firmly. "This is the quality of work that could attract serious directors and major financing." They spent 3 hours going through Edward's scripts. Each one showed the same combination of literary sophistication and cinematic understanding. His adaptation of Dr. Faustus was particularly striking. He'd found ways to visualize the psychological themes that most film adaptations missed entirely. "Edward, I need to ask you something," Michael said finally. "Have you shown these to anyone in the film industry?" "How could I? I'm homeless. No one would take a meeting with me. But you have talent that shouldn't be wasted. These scripts could change your life." Edward shook his head. "Michael, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but look at me. Even if the scripts are good, who would trust someone in my situation with a major film project?" Michael realized that Edward was right about the practical challenges, but wrong about the impossibility of overcoming them. "What if I helped you?" Michael said. "What if I could get these scripts into the right hands?" "You'd do that?" "More than that, I'd like to option one of these scripts myself. The Othello adaptation, I think it could be an incredible film, and I'd love to play Iago." Edward stared at him. "You're serious?" "Completely serious. But first we need to deal with your living situation. You can't develop a film project while sleeping under bridges." Michael's plan was simple but comprehensive. He would provide Edward with temporary accommodation while helping him re-establish himself professionally. In return, Edward would work with Michael to develop his scripts for production. "I don't want charity," Edward said firmly. "This isn't charity. This is business. I believe your work can make money, and I want to be involved in making that happen." They shook hands on the arrangement that afternoon. Within a week, Michael had set Edward up in a small flat in South London and arranged for him to have access to proper writing facilities. The transformation was remarkable. Cleaned up, properly dressed, and working in a professional environment, Edward looked every bit the distinguished Oxford professor he had been. But the real transformation came when Michael arranged for Edward to meet with producers and directors who were interested in literary adaptations. The first meeting was with producer David Putnam, who was known for his intelligent approach to British cinema. "I want you to read this," Michael told Putnam, handing him Edward's Othello script. "But I don't want you to know anything about the writer until after you've read it." 3 days later, Putnam called Michael with excitement in his voice. "Where did you find this writer? This is some of the best adaptation work I've ever seen. The way he's translated Shakespeare's psychological complexity into visual storytelling is extraordinary. The writer is a former Oxford professor who's been living homeless for 4 years." There was a long silence on the phone. "You're joking." "I'm completely serious." Putnam insisted on meeting Edward immediately. Their conversation lasted 4 hours, covering not just the scripts but Edward's academic background, his approach to adaptation, and his understanding of how literature could work in cinema. "I want to option 3 of these scripts," Putnam told Michael afterward. "And I want to hire Edward as a consultant on literary adaptations for our other projects." The news transformed Edward's life overnight. Within a month he had steady income from his consultant work and development deals for his scripts. More importantly, he had his dignity and professional identity restored. But the most significant change was personal. Working again, engaging with creative projects, collaborating with other intelligent people, it brought Edward back to life in ways that went beyond financial security. I realize now that I'd been punishing myself for surviving, Edward told Michael 6 months after their first meeting. I thought that if I lost everything, my career, my home, my comfort, it would somehow honor my family's memory. But they wouldn't have wanted that. Edward's Othello adaptation went into production 2 years later, with Michael playing Iago as he'd promised. The film received critical acclaim and numerous awards, establishing Edward as one of Britain's most respected screenplay writers. But more importantly, it proved that talent and dignity could survive even the most devastating circumstances, and that sometimes the most unlikely friendships could change everything. At the film's premiere, Edward was interviewed by the BBC about his remarkable journey from Oxford professor to homeless man to celebrated screenwriter. "How do you explain such an extraordinary reversal of fortune?" the interviewer asked. Edward looked across the room to where Michael was talking with other guests. "I met someone who saw potential where others saw only a problem," Edward said. "Michael didn't try to rescue me from my circumstances. He helped me rescue myself. He believed in my work before anyone else did, and he treated me as a colleague rather than a charity case." "What do you think would have happened if you'd never met him?" Edward considered the question carefully. "I think I would have continued reading Under That Bridge until I died, not because I couldn't have changed my situation, but because I'd forgotten that I was capable of change. Michael reminded me that losing everything doesn't mean you've lost yourself." The interviewer asked one final question. "What's your advice for people who find themselves in seemingly hopeless situations?" "Two things," Edward replied. "First, remember that circumstances can change much faster than you think possible. Second, never underestimate the power of one person choosing to see your potential rather than your problems." Today, Edward Whitman is considered one of Britain's foremost experts on adapting classical literature for modern media. He has written award-winning screenplays, returned to teaching as a visiting professor at several universities, and established a foundation that helps homeless people develop their creative and intellectual talents. But the story of his transformation began with something even more remarkable than professional success. It began with his gradual return to emotional life. In the months following his meeting with Michael, Edward slowly began to reconnect with parts of himself that had been buried since his family's death. Working again gave him purpose, but it was the human connections that truly brought him back to life. "I remember the first time I laughed after meeting Michael," Edward reflected in a 2005 interview with The Guardian. "We were discussing a particularly absurd note that a studio executive had written about my Hamlet adaptation. He wanted me to make Hamlet more upbeat and give him a love interest who survives. Michael's reaction was so perfectly outraged that I found myself laughing for the first time in years. It was like remembering how to breathe." The collaboration between Michael and Edward deepened over time, extending far beyond their initial business arrangement. They discovered a genuine friendship based on shared intellectual curiosity and mutual respect for each other's craft. Michael introduced Edward to other actors, directors, and writers who appreciated his scholarly approach to adaptation. Edward in turn helped Michael develop a deeper understanding of the classical texts he'd performed but never fully analyzed academically. "Edward changed how I approach Shakespeare," Michael said in a 1985 interview. "I'd always focused on the emotional truth of the characters, but Edward taught me to see the intellectual architecture underneath. He showed me how Shakespeare builds meaning through language patterns, historical references, and philosophical frameworks that most actors never notice." Their professional partnership proved remarkably fruitful. After the success of the Othello adaptation, they collaborated on several other projects, including a critically acclaimed television series that brought Shakespeare's lesser-known plays to mainstream audiences. But perhaps more significantly, Edward's story began to attract attention from social workers, charity organizations, and government officials who were trying to understand homelessness in a more nuanced way. "Edward's case challenged every assumption we had about homeless people," said Margaret Collins, who worked for Westminster Council's Social Services Department at the time. "Here was someone with extraordinary intellectual gifts who had ended up on the streets not because of mental illness, addiction, or lack of education, but because of grief and social isolation." It made us realize how many other talented people we might be overlooking. Edward's Foundation, established in 1983, became a model for programs that focused on identifying and nurturing the hidden talents of homeless individuals. Rather than simply providing basic services, the foundation worked to understand what skills, knowledge, and creative abilities people had developed before becoming homeless. The traditional approach to homelessness assumes that people have nothing to offer, Edward explained to a parliamentary committee investigating social services. But every person has accumulated knowledge, skills, and perspectives that could be valuable to society. Our job is to create pathways for those abilities to be recognized and utilized. The Foundation's first major success story was Thomas Anderson, a former mathematics professor from Edinburgh who had been living rough in Glasgow for 3 years after losing his position due to alcoholism. Edward's team discovered that Thomas had been working on groundbreaking research in number theory during his homeless period, writing equations on scraps of paper and storing them in a cardboard box. With the Foundation's support, Thomas completed his research, published papers that attracted international attention, and eventually returned to academic life. His work contributed to advances in computer encryption that are still used today. Edward taught me that homelessness doesn't erase who you are, Thomas said at a conference about social innovation. It just makes who you are invisible to most people. The Foundation made me visible again. Over the years, the Foundation helped dozens of homeless individuals reconnect with their professional lives. A former orchestra conductor who had been busking in tube stations returned to leading classical music programs for young people. A retired engineer living in a shelter designed water purification systems that were adopted by international development organizations. A former teacher created literacy programs that transformed how homeless shelters approached education. But Edward never forgot the personal dimension of his own transformation. He remained in regular contact with the people who had helped him rebuild his life, and he made sure that everyone supported by his foundation received not just professional assistance, but human connection and emotional support. The most important thing Michael gave me wasn't career advice or financial support, Edward often told foundation donors. It was the reminder that I still had something valuable to contribute. When you lose everything, you begin to believe that you've become worthless. Michael helped me remember that my mind, my knowledge, and my capacity to create still had value. This philosophy influenced how Edward approached his return to academic life. When Oxford University invited him to return as a visiting professor in 1984, he insisted that his courses be made available to non-traditional students, including people experiencing homelessness or social displacement. His course, Literature and Social Resilience, examined how great writers had responded to personal tragedy, social upheaval, and economic displacement. Students rate authors who had written while in exile, in prison, or during times of personal crisis, analyzing how creative expression could serve as a tool for survival and recovery. Professor Whitman's class wasn't just about literature, recalled Sarah Davies, who took the course in 1985. It was about how human beings find meaning and maintain dignity under the most challenging circumstances. He taught us that creativity isn't a luxury, it's a necessity for psychological survival. The course became so popular that Edward was invited to teach similar programs at universities across Britain and eventually internationally. His book, Reading in the Ruins, Literature as Survival, became required reading and social work programs and was translated into 12 languages. But perhaps the most meaningful aspect of Edward's new life was his gradual ability to reconnect with memories of his family without being overwhelmed by grief. For years, every thought of Helen, James, and Sarah was pure pain, Edward wrote in his memoir, published in 1990. But as I began creating again, as I started contributing to the world rather than just surviving in it, I found that I could remember them with love rather than just loss. Edward established a scholarship fund in his family's memory that supported young people from disadvantaged backgrounds who wanted to pursue studies in literature and the arts. The scholarship recipients were required to spend part of their program working with homeless and marginalized communities, continuing the cycle of connection and support that had saved Edward's own life. Michael remained closely involved in Edward's foundation work, serving on the board of directors and using his celebrity status to raise awareness and funding for their programs. People often ask me what I'm most proud of in my career, Michael said at a 2000 gala celebrating the foundation's work. Yes, I've won awards and made films that people remember, but I'm most proud of the afternoon I decided to stop and talk to a man reading under a bridge. That conversation led to friendships, creative partnerships, and social programs that have helped hundreds of people reclaim their lives. The relationship between Michael and Edward also influenced Michael's subsequent charitable work and his approach to using his fame for social good. He became an advocate for more nuanced approaches to poverty and homelessness, arguing that society needed to look beyond people's circumstances to see their potential contributions. Edward taught me that helping people isn't just about providing services, Michael explained in a 2003 interview. It's about recognizing the dignity and value that people retain even when they've lost everything else. When you treat someone as if they have something important to offer, you often discover that they do. The impact of their friendship extended beyond social work into their respective artistic endeavors. Edward's academic writing became more accessible and emotionally resonant, influenced by his experience of connecting with people from all walks of life. Michael's performances gained additional depth and authenticity, informed by his deeper understanding of how people maintain their humanity under pressure. Their collaboration on the Tempest adaptation, produced in 1987, was widely regarded as the finest Shakespeare film of its era. The project combined Edward's scholarly insight with Michael's understanding of cinematic storytelling, creating a work that was both intellectually rigorous and emotionally powerful. The Tempest won several international awards and established a new standard for literary adaptations, but more importantly, it demonstrated how creative partnerships could transcend social boundaries and produce work that neither collaborator could have achieved alone. 25 years after their first meeting under the railway bridge, Michael and Edward were both invited to speak at a conference on creativity and social innovation. Their presentation, The Hidden Talents of the Marginalized, drew standing ovations and inspired new programs in cities across Europe and North America. The most radical thing you can do, Edward told the audience, is to assume that everyone has something valuable to contribute. When Michael stopped to talk to me that day, he wasn't just helping a homeless man, he was discovering a scholar, a writer, and ultimately a friend. How many other discoveries are we missing because we don't take the time to look beyond people's circumstances? In the audience that day was a young social worker named Patricia Williams, who was inspired by their story to start a program in Birmingham that paired homeless individuals with mentors from their former professions. The program, called Hidden Talents, became a national model and helped hundreds of people reconnect with their careers and communities. Edward and Michael's story taught us that homelessness is often temporary, but talent is permanent, Patricia explained in a documentary about the program. When we focus on what people can do rather than what they've lost, amazing things happen. The ripple effects of that chance encounter under a London bridge continued to spread for decades. Edward's foundation grew into an international organization with chapters in 12 countries. His books on literature and social resilience became standard texts in universities worldwide. And Michael continued to use his platform to advocate for more humane and intelligent approaches to social challenges. But perhaps most importantly, their friendship demonstrated that meaningful connections can transcend social boundaries and that everyone, regardless of their circumstances, has something valuable to offer to the world. Michael Caine's decision to stop and talk to a man reading under a bridge led to one of the most remarkable comeback stories in British entertainment history. But perhaps more importantly, it demonstrated that genius and dignity can survive in the most unlikely places, and that the difference between tragedy and triumph sometimes comes down to one person being willing to look beyond appearances and see the human potential that others miss. The homeless man Michael Caine discovered reading Shakespeare under a London bridge wasn't just a former Oxford professor with extraordinary talent. He was a reminder that society's most vulnerable people often carry gifts that could enrich everyone's lives, if only someone takes the time to notice and care enough to help.